Okay, so if you go to lijo.github.io, you'll find the link to these slides and the example code that I'm going to show. So last year last year I gave a presentation on this module, which is a plugin to allow you to implement a OAuth2 server in Modulicious. And at the time I threatened to split it out from Modulicious into its own namespace so it could be reusable for whatever you want to reuse it for. And I actually ended up doing that last year. And the reason I did that is because I started writing this module, which uses OAuth 2, but it doesn't use the authorization code grant, it uses a password grant. Now, if you're familiar with OAuth 2, it has all these different grant types. So at the time, I thought I'd done the right thing, and then actually it turned out I needed to do another thing. And the reason I split this module out into its own namespace is to implement that functionality so I could test against this module. And what I've kind of learned as I've been writing these modules that interact with APIs is it's very, very useful to have a good local test suite, because test servers don't tend to have SLAs, so they break your tests and they break your continuous integration, which leads you, on a wild goose chase. REST, which is that thing, which I'm sure you all know of. So I was looking at the Mondo docs, which is the module I was writing, and they kind of looked familiar to me. They looked a lot like lots of other REST docs. This is Stripe, and you've got cardless, all payment service providers, basically. This one I think is PayPal. Yeah, they've got PayPal, and we have Campaign Monitor, Facebook, Twitter. And you look at the docs, and they're quite. You get the initial impression that they're all doing the same thing in terms of the way you implement it, but you dive a bit deeper and you see, as we've already heard about yesterday in a couple of talks, is they are often very subtly different, because REST it's not a clearly defined thing. Well, it is a clearly defined thing, but it's kind of, the horse is bolted, so everybody's doing their own implementations. So you delve into the docs and you'll see examples of responses. So this is Mondo, which is obviously quite a sensible thing to return. You look at, I think this is Stripe, which uses an epoch time, which is fair enough. You look at PayPal. This is Go Cardless, which says send as a reference if it's this payment type, but it needs to be this long in this particular type, or something else in this particular type, and they're not clear about what happens if you send the wrong reference. Do you get a 400 bad request, or I don't know. You look at PayPal, and it turns out you can kind of gather how they've implemented this in the back end, in that you can use their API, but only to get transactions sent using their API, so you can access stuff that's gone over the web, which, okay, fair enough. You look at Campaign Monitor, and they say all our endpoints return JSON apart from one which returns XML. So we're kind of getting sidetracked a bit. And Facebook wants you to send the auth amount, the auth currency as a base 64 encoded string, which doesn't strike me as the best thing to do, but fair enough, that's the way they've implemented it. And Twitter say, oh, we use the GeoJSON standard, but actually the longitude and the latitude are reversed, so they don't really use the GeoJSON standard. And you get these all sorts of interesting implementations. So this is one I used recently. It's kind of a buzzword bingo for an API. They're using the REST API, but it wraps a spool blockchain protocol. So we're getting all these crossing of the streams. This is a conversation I was having with the developer of one of the APIs I was integrating with, and we were kind of arguing about, should I use, they don't want to use HTTP status codes to represent errors because it's the transport, it's not the application. And I thought, fair enough, but if you look at Uber, they actually do it very well. They're using a 403 here, but they have two different codes, and to represent actually quite sensible things, I think, in terms of use cases. And the RFC says, well, it doesn't really say much. It says do what you want, basically. And you kind of end up in that situation, which is basically that situation. And you go to Wikipedia, which you think would be quite a good resource, but then you look at the talk page, and you get lots of arguments. So it's kind of the ultimate form of bike shedding. And you think, well, I'll grab a book on this, and the book will sort this out. And this is just from O'Reilly. This is 6 years, 5 books, 4 different authors. And I've only read the first 3. I haven't read the last 2, but I remember correctly, the first 3 do contradict one another in quite key areas. So you do a bit of Googling and you find other books, and you kind of end up in this inevitable end state. I'm not making this up. This is actually a book that's recently come out, so I haven't read it yet. I've got it on order. But I'm not interested in bike shedding, and it seems that somebody's trademarked the term anyway. So I don't know if, oh well, maybe they've trademarked the term shed. It's not very clear from the graphic design of that which is trademarked. So my approach is to write an emulator. And I try and keep it as simple as possible. So I'm just basically returning standard JSON. Doesn't store anything in a backend. It doesn't write to a database. It's literally return this JSON structure. And I find it's great for TDD because it's like TDD on steroids. You get this enormous amount of test coverage without having to monkey patch LWP or module user agent or whatever you're using to send this stuff over the wire. And you can improve your CI coverage without relying on that test server that doesn't have an SLA, which will break your CI server and kind of render your CI server not as useful as you would like it to be. So an example here of the emulator I wrote for this Mondo module, that's probably not very clear, so what I'll do is I'll bring up a bit better, I think. So what we have here is we have an OAuth2 server, so I can do that password grant in a few lines of code. It uses JWTs, so you can stop the emulator and start it again, and it will remember your access token. It doesn't need to store that access token anywhere. And as I said, we are basically just returning JSON. I try and keep it as simple as possible. So I just I read the docs, and I have the emulator open here in another window. This endpoint returns this JSON. Okay, get accounts, copy paste the example from the API docs. And it's about, I think about 300 lines of code. Yeah, with all doing a bit of the massaging, because the way they've implemented the params is it's REST, so it's their own special way of doing it. Find my window. Here we go. So this is how I run it. This is a shell script which fires up the emulator, grabs an access token from the emulator, and then runs a set of end-to-end tests. So if we actually run that, first off, if I run the test, you'll see that we actually skip the end-to-end test because I have a comprehensive set of unit tests anyway. But running the end-to-end test, you see it fires through. It's quite quick. It's quite nice. I do print out all the debug there because obviously it's useful to have that. But this end-to-end test can also speak to the live server. So I've made an effort to make my test suite pass against the emulator and the live server. And obviously, one of the cons of using an emulator is obviously the live server is maybe a moving target. You would hope not. You would hope they would version their API and not break their clients using it. But that's not always the case. So if I actually run the same test suite, well, I'll just prove it first. I mean, if we cat end-to-end emulator.sh, we see it's running t end-to-end.t. If we cat that, it's running exactly the same test, but I have an access token that I grabbed from their live server. So if I run, what I've done is I have stored my access token, and hopefully that access token is still valid. It seems to be, so it's running a little bit slower, and hopefully if it is working, it will actually Yeah, I got a little alert on my phone, so it's definitely hit the Mondo live endpoint. So just from that emulator, I'm getting a good 80% test coverage. And then I add the unit tests, and I get close to, well, I'm getting 95%, almost 100% statement coverage. So just as a base set of tests, very little effort there. I've got what I hope is quite reasonable coverage. But my main suggestion is if you do build a RESTful API to give to provide a service, don't just release the docs, but try and release an emulator. And as I said, I don't mean a test server, I mean something people can actually download and run locally, because it's nice to run it locally and have it be consistent and quick, because we like our tests to be quick. And also dog food it, because I think we write our APIs and we write tests against our APIs, but perhaps we don't really use our APIs as clients would use our APIs. So we're kind of blinkered from the holes that might be there. And of course, update it when you update your API docs. Just to expand on that, there is, I think you probably heard it mentioned yesterday, there's this new push to use open standards for APIs. So we have Swagger and OpenAPI, well, they're the same thing basically. And what I have been trying to do is, I've not had time to do it yet, I'm trying to make the modulacious plugin OpenAPI module emulate given a flag, because the OpenAPI spec defines the JSON schema for your responses. So surely if we have what we're going to return in the configuration, we can just use that to return example JSON. So in theory, that Mondo emulator we saw, which was 300 lines, becomes 10 lines of code, which I think would be very powerful. And also OpenAPI, it generates your routes in your app, it generates your documentation, and now we can also have it generating your tests, essentially. So the laziness is kind of expanded, which I think is great. I've not quite got there yet. I've got the patch in OpenAPI, but I need to patch JSON validator to actually figure out how to read the JSON schema and generate the response JSON. So this is me developing the Mondo, the business Mondo module. And one of the key reasons I wrote the emulator is because I didn't get access to the API up until, I think, the third commit from the top there. So I was actually developing against an API that I couldn't access, because you don't receive access until you get the debit card. And I wanted to kind of get this, I had some free time, and I wanted to get this done and out there before I didn't have any time. And having written the emulator against their docs, when I received my card and ran my test suite against the live endpoint, I just needed to make a trivial fix because the docs were slightly out of sync with their API. But in the end, it turned out the reason I'd originally done this kind of disappeared. They were going to deprecate password grant, so my path down splitting out the module and normalizing it actually turned out to be for nothing. So that's basically my one-sentence suggestion, write an emulator. I think if we can do this in a way that's trivial using OpenAPI and one line of code to do it, I think it would be very, very powerful. So that's it. Any questions? Sure.
Well, I'd like to add something, because I also recently wrote an emulator. And the good thing about an emulator is that you can also emulate all the faults.
Yeah, so the statement was that you can emulate all the errors you might get, the faults you might get from the live endpoint. And again, with OpenAPI, you do actually have to document, this is a 200 and the response example, then you 404, 401, 501. So again, we can emulate that if we have a full Swagger spec. Any more questions? Sure. it's compounded. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's down to writing. Well, the statement was that if you're implementing a client and a server, don't use modules from the same, well, maybe the same distribution or not the same author. But I think that's down to having, like I said, dog fooding your API and writing good tests. So I think you could apply that to not just APIs, but code in general, perhaps. Okay, any more questions? Okay, thank you very much.